Hey guys, tonight we are going to explore one of the most complex and haunting chapters in human history, Nazi Germany during World War II. We'll journey through the rise of a movement that reshaped a nation, the ideology that drove its actions, the people who lived through it, and the events that ultimately brought it down. This is a story of ambition, power, tragedy, and the human experience in extreme circumstances. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you enjoy the type of content that merges myth and mystery. And hey, let us know where you are watching from, what time it is for you right now. It's time now to dim the lights and let's cover what we have for tonight together. The First World War ended in 1918, leaving Europe scarred in ways that are difficult to imagine. For Germany, the aftermath was particularly harsh. Cities and towns lay in rubble from years of bombardment, with entire neighborhoods destroyed and basic infrastructure disrupted. Factories that had produced weapons during the war now stood silent or partially dismantled, and the economy, already strained by the immense cost of fighting, teetered on the edge of collapse. The human cost was staggering. Millions of soldiers returned home physically wounded, psychologically traumatized, and emotionally unsettled, while civilians struggled to cope with shortages, hunger, and the lingering devastation. In addition to physical destruction, Germany faced profound political upheaval. The German Empire, ruled by the Kaiser, had collapsed in the final months of the war, replaced by the Weimar Republic, a fragile, democratic experiment in a nation unaccustomed to self-rule. The transition was chaotic. Soldiers returned from the front, expecting honor and opportunity, only to find revolution in the streets and a new government struggling to establish legitimacy. Many Germans viewed the Weimar Republic as weak, ineffective, and unable to address the crises of post-war society. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, compounded these problems and sowed seeds of resentment that would later be exploited by extremist movements. Germany was forced to accept full responsibility for the war, pay massive reparations, and cede territories to neighboring nations. Industrial regions like the Saarland were placed under foreign administration, and the Rhineland was demilitarized, leaving Germany vulnerable in its own heartland. These measures were intended to prevent future aggression, yet they left the German population humiliated and angry, creating a pervasive sense of injustice. Economic instability only worsened the situation. The early 1920s saw hyperinflation that wiped out the savings of ordinary citizens. A loaf of bread could cost billions of marks, and people who had worked hard their entire lives suddenly found their wealth worthless. The middle class, in particular, felt betrayed and vulnerable, and social unrest grew. Strikes, protests, and street violence became common as the government struggled to stabilize the currency and economy. Meanwhile, unemployment soared, leaving millions without work or prospects for the future. But economic and political turmoil was only part of the picture. Socially, Germany was grappling with profound changes. Women, who had taken on new roles during the war, were now expected to return to domestic life. While returning, soldiers sought to reclaim their place in society. The war had also brought new ideas about class, citizenship, and national identity. Many Germans were searching for meaning and direction in a world that suddenly seemed unpredictable and unfair. It was in this context of despair and uncertainty that extremist movements began to emerge. Groups promising order, national pride, and revival found eager audiences among those disillusioned by the Weimar Republic. Some of these movements were explicitly political, seeking to overthrow the government, while others offered cultural or social solutions, emphasizing tradition and returning to an idealized vision of Germany. Among these, the National Socialist German Workers' Party would eventually rise to prominence, drawing on both economic hardship and national humiliation to attract followers. The trauma of war extended beyond immediate suffering. Veterans carried deep psychological scars, known at the time as shell shock, which today we recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. Many returned with a sense of betrayal, feeling that their sacrifices had been wasted and that the new government did not respect their service. This sense of grievance became a powerful tool for political manipulators who could appeal to wounded pride, promising that Germany's honor would be restored and its enemies defeated. Education and culture also reflected the upheaval. Schools faced overcrowding and shortages, while literature, art, and theater explored themes of loss, disillusionment, and longing for stability. Intellectuals debated the meaning of Germany's defeat and the path forward, often questioning the value of democracy itself. The societal conversation was dominated by uncertainty. How could Germany rebuild? What lessons should be drawn from the war? And who could be trusted to lead the nation out of chaos? Moreover, the global context amplified Germany's struggles. The 1920s saw the rise of the United States and other powers, while European neighbors cautiously watched Germany's attempts to recover. International loans and economic programs, such as the Dawes Plan, temporarily stabilized the German economy, but dependency on foreign money left the nation vulnerable to global shocks, including the Great Depression later in the decade. These external pressures added layers of complexity to the internal struggles of a country trying to rebuild its identity and economy. In short, the period after World War I was a crucible. It was a time of devastation and loss, but also of political ferment and social questioning. Germany was a nation wounded in body, economy, and spirit, searching for answers in a world that seemed indifferent to its suffering. It was in this environment that ideas promising restoration and strength could take root, often by exploiting fear, anger, and a longing for stability. Understanding this context is essential for grasping why Nazi Germany emerged when it did, why it gained support, and why its ideology resonated so strongly with so many. As we move forward, it is important to remember that these ashes of the First World War were more than ruins of buildings or money. They were the emotional, political, and social foundations upon which history would soon build something extraordinary, terrifying, and unforgettable. In the next section, we will examine how one of these movements, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, rose from obscurity to become the dominant force in German politics, drawing on the pain, pride, and ambitions of a nation desperate for direction. In the turbulent years following Germany's defeat in World War I, a variety of political groups emerged, each claiming to have the solution to the nation's suffering. Among them, one movement would eventually change the course of history, The National Socialist German Workers' Party, better known as the Nazi Party. Its rise was neither sudden nor inevitable. Rather, it was the product of deep social discontent, political instability, economic hardship, and the lingering humiliation of defeat. Understanding its origins helps us comprehend how a small political faction could grow to dominate an entire nation. The movement began as a small, obscure political organization in Munich in 1919, originally called the German Workers' Party. Germany at the time was filled with political ferment. Monarchists, communists, socialists, and nationalist groups all vied for influence, each presenting visions of what a restored Germany should look like. Among these, the fledgling party distinguished itself by blending nationalist rhetoric with populist appeals to ordinary workers, claiming that they were the true defenders of Germany against the dual threats of foreign influence and internal decay. Early members were often disaffected war veterans, students, and lower middle class citizens who felt alienated by the Weimar Republic. They were searching for identity, stability, and a sense of purpose in a country that seemed directionless. They believed that Germany's military defeat was not just a loss on the battlefield, but a moral failure of leadership and loyalty at home. Into this environment, the German Workers' Party offered a sense of belonging, camaraderie, and a clear target for their grievances. Politicians, communists, Jews, and foreign powers. The party's ideology was a careful combination of anti-communism, anti-Semitism, nationalism, and social reform. Its message was deliberately simple, yet emotionally powerful. Germany had been betrayed. It had the potential to rise again, and it was the duty of its citizens to support a strong, disciplined, and united state. This clarity of purpose resonated with a population desperate for certainty in uncertain times. People wanted someone to tell them what went wrong and how it could be fixed, and the party promised answers, solutions, and a sense of pride. A key figure in the party's growth was Adolf Hitler, who joined shortly after its formation. Hitler brought charisma, energy, and a profound understanding of human psychology. His speeches were magnetic, drawing crowds with a combination of emotion, theatricality, and repetition. He had an uncanny ability to sense the moods of an audience, amplifying anger, fear, hope, and pride in ways that seemed almost instinctual. While the party had a platform, Hitler's oratory brought it to life, transforming abstract ideas into a powerful call to action. Organizationally, the party was meticulous. It developed structures that included youth organizations, paramilitary groups, and local chapters across Germany. This allowed it to reach people at the grassroots level, organizing rallies, meetings, and propaganda campaigns that made the movement visible and compelling. The early adoption of modern propaganda techniques, including posters, newspapers, and public demonstrations, helped the party embed itself into the daily lives of ordinary Germans. Even in its early years, the Nazis understood that perception was as important as policy, and they cultivated an image of energy, discipline, and inevitability. Economics also played a critical role in the party's rise. Hyperinflation in the early 1920s, combined with high unemployment and economic instability, left many Germans desperate. The Nazi Party promised solutions that appealed to the middle class, workers, and veterans alike. They pledged to protect property, restore jobs, and rebuild national pride. This ability to craft messages that resonated across social classes made the movement increasingly attractive, even to those who might not have agreed with all of its ideology. Cultural factors were also significant. The post-war period saw a flourishing of ideas, art, and debate, but also anxiety about change. Many Germans were disoriented by modernist trends in art and society, which seemed to threaten traditional values. The Nazi Party capitalized on this unease, presenting itself as a guardian of German culture, heritage, and identity. Festivals, rallies, and pageantry created a sense of community and purpose, reinforcing the party's message and making membership and participation appealing. By the mid-1920s, the party had grown steadily. Though it remained on the fringes of political power, its membership included a mix of idealists, opportunists, and those seeking protection or advancement. Some were drawn to the party's vision of a renewed Germany. Others were attracted by its social networks and sense of belonging. This diversity of motivation contributed to its resilience, allowing it to survive periods of political setbacks, economic hardship, and internal disagreements. One of the defining characteristics of the Nazi Party's early years was its ability to adapt and learn from failure. The failed beer hall putsch in 1923, for example, could have ended the party's ambitions. Instead, it became a learning experience. Hitler and other leaders realized that violent overthrow was premature and that gaining power through political channels and public persuasion was a more effective strategy. The movement became more sophisticated, building alliances, refining propaganda, and patiently expanding its influence across German society. By the late 1920s, the combination of economic distress, social anxiety, political instability, and skilled leadership had turned the National Socialist German Workers' Party from a small, obscure group into a rising force in German politics. Its ability to blend ideology, spectacle, propaganda, and organization created a blueprint for future success, setting the stage for the dramatic events of the 1930s. Understanding the birth of the Nazi Party is essential for comprehending the dynamics that allowed it to seize control of Germany. It was not just ideology or luck, but a convergence of social, economic, political, and cultural factors, guided by the charisma and strategic thinking of its leaders. The movement's early years demonstrate how extremism can grow in environments of uncertainty, offering lessons that remain relevant today. In the next section, we will examine Adolf Hitler himself, his background, personality, and the qualities that allowed him to transform a marginal political group into the dominant force in German politics, shaping the course of history in ways that would resonate far beyond Germany's borders. Adolf Hitler was born on April 20th, 1889, in the small Austrian town of Braunau am Inn, near the German border. His early life was marked by both ordinary experiences and personal struggles that, in hindsight, seem to have shaped his worldview and ambitions. He was the fourth of six children in a family that was, by many accounts, strict and demanding. His father, Alois Hitler, was a customs official known for his authoritarian demeanor, while his mother, Clara, was gentle and protective. A figure who would have a profound influence on young Adolf Hitler's childhood was relatively unremarkable in some ways, Yet it was also defined by contradictions. He was reportedly a bright and imaginative child, particularly drawn to drawing and painting, yet he also struggled with authority figures and formal schooling. His ambitions to become an artist were encouraged by some family members, but often met with practical resistance. He applied twice to the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts and was rejected both times, an experience that would leave a lasting mark on his self-perception and sense of frustration. After leaving school, Hitler spent his late teens and early 20s in Vienna, a city of cultural richness and stark social contrasts. Vienna was a hub of art, music, and intellectual activity, but it was also a city rife with poverty, political agitation, and ethnic tension. Hitler's time there exposed him to a range of ideas, some uplifting, some toxic. He developed a fascination with German nationalism and a growing disdain for what he perceived as societal decay, political instability, and the influence of groups he considered foreign or undesirable. Anti-Semitic ideas, which were already present in some circles of Vienna's intellectual and political life, left a lasting impression on him during these years. Despite his artistic ambitions, Hitler's attempts to support himself in Vienna were largely unsuccessful. He lived in cheap hostels, struggled financially, and painted postcards and small works for income. Yet, even in these difficult circumstances, he was reportedly charismatic, opinionated, and intensely focused on his personal vision of what the world should be. Some historians note that these years in Vienna allowed him to cultivate a sense of detachment, observation, and strategy that would later manifest in his political life. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 marked a turning point in Hitler's life. He enlisted in the Bavarian army, despite being Austrian by birth, and served on the Western Front. His experience as a soldier deeply shaped his identity, providing both a sense of purpose and an emotional framework that he would carry into his political career. He was wounded twice, gassed once, and received several medals for bravery, including the Iron Cross. More importantly, the war instilled in him a profound sense of camaraderie, loyalty, and belief in the importance of decisive leadership, qualities that he would later leverage in his rise to power. The end of the war brought disappointment and disillusionment. Like many Germans, Hitler felt betrayed by the defeat and the political upheaval that followed. He was deeply affected by what became known as the stab in the back myth, the idea that Germany had been betrayed from within by politicians, communists, and other groups rather than losing militarily on the battlefield. This belief reinforced his growing resentment and fueled his desire to take action, shaping his understanding of enemies, loyalty, and the use of political power. After the war, Hitler remained in the army for a brief period, assigned to a role in intelligence and political observation. This position introduced him to the world of political organizing and propaganda. He was tasked with monitoring political movements in Munich, and it was during this time that he first encountered the German Workers' Party, the precursor to the Nazi Party. Hitler's combination of charisma, oratory skill, and strategic thinking quickly allowed him to rise within the organization, setting the stage for the leadership role he would soon assume. Hitler's early years also revealed his extraordinary skill as a communicator. He had a remarkable ability to read a room, sense the emotional state of his audience, and use speech, gesture, and pacing to stir feelings of unity, anger, or hope. These talents, honed during years of struggle and observation, became central to the Nazi Party's growth. His speeches did not merely convey ideas, they created experiences, allowing listeners to feel part of a movement larger than themselves. It's important to note that while Hitler's early life included hardship, rejection, and exposure to toxic ideas, it also demonstrates the interplay of personality, circumstance, and opportunity. His ambitions were not born in isolation. They were shaped by the cultural, social, and political currents of Austria and Germany during a time of upheaval. The combination of personal resilience, persuasive skill, and opportunistic insight allowed him to transform frustration and ideology into a powerful political presence. By the early 1920s, Hitler had left Vienna and settled in Munich, where the seeds of his future political career began to take root. He was no longer a struggling artist or a war veteran. He had become a politically aware, ideologically driven, and strategically minded individual ready to seize opportunities. His understanding of propaganda, mass psychology, and social networks would soon propel him from obscurity to the forefront of German politics. In summary, Hitler's early years were a complex mixture of ordinary life, personal ambition, disappointment, and exposure to social and political ideas that would define his future. They show how a combination of circumstances, talent, and ideology can converge in a single individual, creating conditions for influence and ultimately historical transformation. Understanding this period is essential to grasping how Hitler came to lead the Nazi Party and, eventually, Germany itself. In the next section, we will explore the failed Beer Hall Putsch and the creation of Mein Kampf, a moment that illustrates how early setbacks were transformed into strategy, ideology, and the blueprint for a movement that would ultimately dominate an entire nation. By the early 1920s, Adolf Hitler had become a rising figure within the German Workers' Party, bringing charisma, organizational skill, and a vision that resonated with a population struggling with post-war humiliation and economic hardship. Yet, while Hitler had influence within a growing political movement, Germany itself remained a fragile democracy under the Weimar Republic, beset by political fragmentation, uprisings, and social unrest. In this environment, Hitler and his followers believed that decisive, bold action could accelerate their rise to power, even if it meant challenging the government directly. This belief led to the infamous Beer Hall Putsch of 1923, an early turning point in Hitler's political journey. The Beer Hall Putsch, sometimes described as a march on Munich, was a failed coup attempt aimed at seizing control of the Bavarian government as a precursor to overthrowing the Weimar Republic. Hitler, along with several co-conspirators and members of the paramilitary Sturmabteilung SA, sought to capitalize on a climate of dissatisfaction, economic distress, and nationalist sentiment. Hyperinflation was devastating the German economy at the time, leaving people desperate and disillusioned, and Hitler hoped to rally them to a bold, decisive action to reclaim Germany's honor. On the evening of November 8, 1923, Hitler and his followers stormed a public gathering at the Bürgerbräukeller beer hall in Munich, where Gustav von Kahr, the state commissioner of Bavaria, was addressing a crowd. Hitler interrupted the proceedings, declaring that a national revolution was underway and that the Bavarian government had been overthrown. He attempted to coerce Kahr and other officials into supporting the coup, but the initial euphoria quickly gave way to hesitation. The Bavarian authorities did not act as Hitler had expected, and their resistance set the stage for failure. The following day, Hitler and his followers attempted to march through Munich toward the city center, intending to rally support and seize key government buildings. However, local police forces confronted the marchers, and a brief but violent clash ensued. 17 Nazis and 4 police officers were killed, and the coup collapsed within hours. Hitler fled, but was arrested shortly afterward. The beer hall putsch was a public and dramatic failure, leaving the Nazi Party temporarily weakened and exposing its leader to legal consequences. Yet, the failure of the coup did not end Hitler's political ambitions. In fact, it became an opportunity for reflection, recalibration, and strategic thinking. During his imprisonment at Landsberg prison, Hitler was able to observe, read, and plan without the distractions of active political campaigning. He spent most of his time writing Mein Kampf, a work that would become both a manifesto of ideology and a personal account of his vision for Germany. The book combined elements of autobiography, political theory, racial ideology, and a blueprint for national revival, making it a foundational text for the Nazi movement. Mein Kampf was not merely a collection of abstract ideas. It articulated a worldview that was both simple and powerful. It presented a vision of Germany as a nation betrayed by internal and external enemies, a country destined to reclaim its rightful place in the world through strong leadership, racial purity, and territorial expansion. Hitler framed history as a struggle between races and nations, presenting the concept of Lebensraum, or living space, which justified expansion to the east as a necessity for the survival and flourishing of the German people. The book also revealed Hitler's understanding of propaganda and mass psychology. He emphasized the importance of appealing to emotion rather than reason, recognizing that people could be mobilized through repeated, simple messages that resonated with fear, hope, pride, and resentment. He wrote about the need for strong leadership, loyalty, and discipline within the party, as well as the dangers of compromise, indecision, and weakness. In essence, Mein Kampf was both a strategic guide and a call to action, demonstrating how ideology and organization could combine to create political power. Hitler's time in prison also allowed him to consider the lessons of failure. The beer hall putsch had demonstrated that violent, premature attempts to seize power were ineffective. He concluded that the Nazi Party needed to gain legitimacy through legal and political channels, cultivating public support gradually rather than relying solely on force. This shift in strategy would later prove crucial, as it allowed the Nazis to expand their influence across Germany while maintaining a disciplined, hierarchical structure ready to exploit opportunities. The publication of Mein Kampf further amplified the Nazi message, reaching audiences beyond Bavaria. While the book was not an immediate bestseller, it circulated among nationalist, anti-communist, and right-wing circles, spreading ideas that would later underpin the party's rise. Its combination of personal narrative, political theory, and ideological prescription made it a powerful tool for shaping public perception, consolidating the beliefs of party members, and recruiting new supporters. It is also worth noting that Hitler's imprisonment and the writing of Mein Kampf helped solidify his image as a committed, unyielding leader. Supporters framed him as a visionary who had endured adversity for the sake of Germany, and his eventual release allowed him to return to politics with renewed focus and legitimacy. The period of apparent inactivity became a stage for narrative building, demonstrating that setbacks could be transformed into opportunities to strengthen both ideology and personal authority. The lessons of the failed coup and the creation of Mein Kampf reverberated throughout the 1920s. The Nazi Party grew steadily, learning to operate within political systems while maintaining the aura of revolutionary potential. Hitler himself honed his skills as a strategist, propagandist, and leader, ensuring that the movement was prepared for future opportunities. The seeds sown in this period, discipline, ideology, charisma, and propaganda, would form the foundation for the dramatic events of the 1930s, when the party transitioned from regional obscurity to national dominance. In summary, the beer hall putsch was more than a failed coup. It was a formative moment. It revealed both the limitations and potential of Hitler and his movement. The subsequent imprisonment provided time for reflection, planning, and the articulation of a coherent, compelling ideological vision. Mein Kampf became a roadmap for the Nazi Party, combining personal narrative, political theory, and strategic guidance, while the lessons learned during this period influenced the party's rise in the years that followed. In the next section, we will examine the struggle for power in the late 1920s, exploring how the Nazi Party transitioned from a regional movement into a political force capable of capturing the hearts and minds of millions across Germany, setting the stage for the dramatic events of the early 1930s. The late 1920s in Germany were a time of uncertainty, anxiety, and profound social upheaval. The country was still reeling from the combined effects of World War I, the Treaty of Versailles, and economic instability. Hyperinflation had wiped out the savings of ordinary citizens, and although the introduction of the Rentenmark in 1923 temporarily stabilized the economy, the scars remained. Unemployment was high, political factions were deeply divided, and the Weimar Republic struggled to maintain legitimacy. It was within this volatile environment that the National Socialist German Workers' Party, under Adolf Hitler's leadership, began its strategic rise from a regional movement into a national political force. At the heart of this struggle was the ability of the Nazi Party to present itself as both a solution to Germany's problems and as the voice of the disenchanted citizen. Hitler and his inner circle understood the power of messaging and spectacle. They created rallies, parades, and public demonstrations that showcased discipline, energy, and unity. These events were more than political gatherings. They were carefully choreographed experiences designed to captivate and inspire ordinary Germans, many of whom felt powerless and frustrated, were drawn to the sense of purpose and belonging that these gatherings offered. The Nazi Party's strategy also relied heavily on propaganda, an area in which Joseph Goebbels, who would later become the Minister of Propaganda, began to make significant contributions. Newspapers, pamphlets, and public speeches were used to spread simple but emotionally powerful messages. The party emphasized themes of national revival, economic recovery, and the restoration of pride and honor to a nation humiliated on the world stage. By targeting specific grievances, such as resentment Over the Treaty of Versailles, fear of communism, and frustration with political elites, the Nazis created a narrative that resonated across social classes. One of the critical elements of this period was the party's ability to capitalize on economic and social distress. Although the late 1920s included a brief period of relative stability known as the Golden Twenties, this prosperity was fragile and unevenly distributed. Many Germans, particularly in rural areas and industrial regions, still recovering from war, faced unemployment, poverty, and uncertainty about the future. The Nazi Party promised solutions, often oversimplified but compelling: jobs for the unemployed, support for the middle class, and a strong government that would restore order and national pride. This economic messaging, combined with emotional appeals to identity and belonging, helped the party gain traction in a way that purely political arguments could not. The Nazis were also adept at targeting specific groups to build their support base. Veterans, who felt betrayed by the Weimar government and humiliated by Germany's defeat, were especially receptive. Hitler emphasized the idea that Germany had been stabbed in the back and that the army and its supporters needed to reclaim honor. Small business owners, who feared communism and economic instability, were reassured by promises of protection and opportunity. Young people, disillusioned by the chaos and lack of direction, were drawn to the sense of purpose offered by organizations like the Hitler Youth. By crafting targeted messages for different segments of society, the Nazis created a multi-layered network of support that was both broad and resilient. Another dimension of the struggle for power was the Nazi Party's relationship with other political factions. Germany, in the late 1920s, was a crowded political landscape, with socialists, communists, conservatives, and other nationalist groups competing for influence. Hitler's strategy involved both confrontation and opportunism. The party's paramilitary wing, the Sturmabteilung, SA, acted as both protection for Nazi rallies and as a deterrent against political opponents, often intimidating rival groups and demonstrating the party's willingness to act decisively. At the same time, Hitler cultivated relationships with conservative elites and industrialists, presenting the Nazis as a viable option for restoring stability while retaining the appearance of legality. Public speaking remained a central tool in this struggle. Hitler's speeches were carefully crafted performances, combining repetition, emotional intensity, and clear ideological framing. He presented complex political and social issues in simple, dramatic terms, often using vivid imagery and historical references that resonated with German audiences. Crowds were encouraged to participate, to cheer, and to feel themselves part of a movement larger than the individual. This ability to engage, persuade, and mobilize people would become one of the most defining characteristics of Nazi success. The late 1920s also saw the Nazis experimenting with media in innovative ways. Posters and pamphlets featured bold imagery, slogans, and symbols designed to convey strength, unity, and inevitability. The swastika, for example, became a visual shorthand for the movement's ideals, immediately recognizable and emotionally evocative. Newspapers sympathetic to nationalist causes helped amplify the party's message, while local meetings and smaller gatherings created personal connections between the leadership and the community. This combination of mass media and intimate social engagement allowed the party to build both visibility and loyalty. International events also played a role in shaping the environment. The relative calm of the mid to late 1920s, punctuated by the Dawes Plan and other international agreements, could not erase the underlying instability. The global economy remained vulnerable, and Germany's dependence on foreign loans meant that any economic shock could quickly ripple across the nation. The Nazis framed these vulnerabilities as evidence of weak leadership and the dangers of external influence, reinforcing their message that only a strong, centralized, and ideologically committed government could restore Germany's strength. By 1928, the Nazi Party was gaining ground in elections, though it remained a minority force in the Reichstag. The struggle for power was far from complete, but the foundations were being laid. The party had developed a disciplined organizational structure, a compelling ideology, sophisticated propaganda, and a charismatic leader in Hitler. These elements combined to create a force capable of exploiting both the vulnerabilities of the Weimar Republic and the fears, hopes, and ambitions of ordinary Germans. The period also demonstrated a key lesson about political movements. Success is rarely immediate or linear. The Nazis experienced setbacks, limited electoral success, and internal disagreements. Yet these challenges forced adaptation, strategic thinking, and refinement of their methods. By learning from mistakes, observing their audience, and cultivating networks of support, the party positioned itself for the dramatic rise to power that would occur in the early 1930s. In summary, the struggle for power in the late 1920s was a period of strategic patience, ideological refinement, and social engagement. The Nazi Party's ability to combine emotional appeals, propaganda, organizational discipline, and targeted messaging allowed it to grow steadily despite setbacks. It was a careful, deliberate effort to transform frustration, uncertainty, and social discontent into a cohesive movement capable of challenging and ultimately overtaking the existing political order. By the early 1930s, Germany was facing an unprecedented crisis. The Great Depression, triggered by the 1929 stock market crash in the United States, had spread across the globe, leaving Germany particularly vulnerable due to its reliance on foreign loans and fragile economic recovery. Factories closed, unemployment soared, and millions of Germans found themselves struggling to survive in a society that seemed increasingly chaotic and insecure. The Weimar Republic, already weakened by years of political instability and public disillusionment, was unable to effectively respond to the crisis. It was in this environment of fear, uncertainty, and economic despair that Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party seized the moment to claim national leadership. In the Reichstag elections of 1930 and 1932, the Nazis made dramatic gains. They went from being a small extremist party to the second largest party in the Reichstag, demonstrating their growing influence and appeal. Their message resonated widely, particularly among the middle class, rural voters, veterans, and the unemployed, who were drawn to promises of national revival, stability, and economic recovery. Hitler's charisma, oratory skill, and ability to present himself as Germany's savior became central to this rapid rise. His speeches tapped into emotion, anger, and hope, creating a sense that he was the one leader capable of rescuing the nation from chaos. Despite these electoral successes, the path to power was not straightforward. President Paul von Hindenburg, a respected military figure from World War I, was reluctant to appoint Hitler as Chancellor. Conservative elites feared Hitler's radicalism, while leftist parties viewed him as a dangerous extremist. Yet the Nazis' growing popularity and the failure of other parties to form stable governments created political gridlock. The perception of inevitability surrounding Hitler and the Nazi Party increased with each passing election, as more Germans believed that supporting or accommodating him was the only way to restore order. Finally, in January 1933, after intense political maneuvering and behind-the-scenes negotiations, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. This moment marked a turning point in history. Though Hitler's cabinet initially included conservatives who believed they could control him, the appointment provided him with the legal authority to implement his vision. The Nazi Party's rise to power was thus a combination of popular support, political opportunity, and strategic calculation. It was not simply a sudden seizure of power, but the culmination of years of careful preparation, ideological development, and exploitation of societal vulnerability. Once in office, the Nazis moved swiftly to consolidate power. One of the first critical events was the Reichstag fire, February 1933. The parliament building was set ablaze, an act that the Nazis blamed on communists. Whether or not they were involved directly, the fire created a climate of fear and urgency that the party exploited to justify emergency measures. The Reichstag fire decree suspended civil liberties, allowed detention without trial, and restricted freedom of speech and assembly. This legal framework enabled the Nazis to suppress opposition while presenting their actions as necessary to protect the nation from internal enemies. Following this, the Enabling Act of March 1933 gave Hitler and his cabinet the authority to pass laws without the Reichstag's approval, effectively establishing a legal dictatorship. This was a masterstroke of political strategy. By using legal mechanisms, the Nazis transformed Germany from a fragile democracy into a totalitarian state, while maintaining a veneer of legitimacy. The Enabling Act allowed Hitler to bypass traditional checks and balances, enact sweeping reforms, and suppress political opponents, laying the foundation for complete control over the government and society. The Nazis also quickly began consolidating control over regional governments, the police, and the judiciary. Independent institutions, political parties, and labor unions were dissolved or absorbed into Nazi structures. The press was censored, and opposition voices were silenced through intimidation, arrest, and propaganda. By controlling both the legal framework and the flow of information, the regime created an environment in which dissent was dangerous and conformity was rewarded. Citizens were made to feel both the power and inevitability of the Nazi state, reinforcing loyalty and submission. Propaganda played a central role in this consolidation. Joseph Goebbels, appointed as Minister of Propaganda, orchestrated campaigns that glorified Hitler, celebrated national pride, and demonized enemies. Public rallies, carefully staged ceremonies, posters, and newspapers reinforced the regime's ideals, presenting the Nazi Party as the embodiment of Germany's destiny. This combination of legal authority, institutional control, and psychological influence ensured that the Nazis' power was not only physical, but also symbolic, permeating every aspect of German life. At the same time, Hitler's personal image as a decisive, charismatic, and infallible leader became a tool of governance. The concept of the Führer, leader with unquestioned authority, was embedded in both law and culture. Citizens were encouraged to identify personally with Hitler, to see him as the embodiment of the nation's hopes and aspirations. Loyalty to the Führer was equated with loyalty to Germany itself, making opposition not just politically dangerous, but morally suspect in the eyes of many. The consolidation of power in 1933 was also marked by the suppression of rivals within the party. While the focus was often on external enemies, internal threats were systematically neutralized through intimidation, purges, or co-optation. This ensured that Hitler maintained control over the Nazi Party itself, preventing factionalism and securing the hierarchy needed to implement his vision across the country. Socially, the early years of Nazi rule began to reshape German life. Civic institutions, schools, and youth organizations were aligned with party ideology, emphasizing obedience, nationalism, and loyalty, while some citizens benefited from employment programs and social initiatives. These were tied directly to support for the regime. The state's increasing presence in everyday life created a society where ideology, loyalty, and conformity were intertwined with practical concerns and personal identity. The significance of 1933 lies not only in Hitler's personal rise to power, but in the methodical, multifaceted approach the Nazis used to secure control. Electoral success, legal mechanisms, propaganda, institutional domination, and social manipulation combined to create a system in which opposition was dangerous and loyalty was incentivized. This moment set the stage for the next decade, during which Germany would be transformed into a totalitarian state, and the consequences of this transformation would reach far beyond its borders. In summary, Hitler's appointment as Chancellor was the culmination of years of strategic planning, charismatic leadership, and exploitation of social and economic conditions. Once in power, the Nazis rapidly consolidated control through a combination of legal authority, institutional takeover, propaganda, and social manipulation. Understanding this critical year is essential to grasping how the Nazi regime was able to dominate Germany, implement its ideology, and ultimately reshape the course of world history. Once Adolf Hitler became Chancellor in 1933, the Nazi Party faced a critical challenge: how to maintain power over a nation that was not uniformly supportive and to suppress any opposition before it could grow. This required not only political authority, but also a sophisticated system of control that penetrated every aspect of German life. The Nazi machinery of control was a complex network of institutions, organizations, and psychological strategies designed to monitor, influence, and dominate the population, creating a society in which obedience was expected and dissent was dangerous. At the heart of this system was the Gestapo, the secret state police, established to root out political opposition and perceived threats to the regime. The Gestapo operated with near total authority. It had the power to arrest individuals without due process, detain them indefinitely, and even send them to concentration camps for protective custody. Citizens were aware that surveillance was constant, whether through informants, neighborhood watch programs, or the Gestapo's intelligence network. The fear of being reported for disloyalty created an atmosphere in which self-censorship and conformity became almost instinctive. Alongside the Gestapo, the Schutzstaffel, or SS, became one of the most powerful instruments of Nazi control. Originally formed as Hitler's personal bodyguard, the SS expanded into a vast organization responsible for internal security, the implementation of racial policies, and the administration of concentration and labor camps. Heinrich Himmler, its leader, oversaw the professionalization and expansion of the SS, transforming it into a highly disciplined and ideologically driven force. Members of the SS were carefully selected and indoctrinated, creating a loyal and fanatical institution capable of enforcing Nazi policy with efficiency and brutality. The Nazi regime also relied heavily on propaganda orchestrated by Joseph Goebbels and his Ministry of Propaganda. This was not merely about producing posters or speeches. It was a totalizing effort to shape perception, control information, and influence thought. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, films, theater, and even literature were all aligned with party ideology. The aim was to create a reality in which the Nazi worldview dominated, where Hitler was portrayed as infallible, enemies were demonized, and the idea of a unified national community was constantly reinforced. Propaganda worked hand in hand with fear to maintain control. When people believed in the narrative of the state, compliance became a form of self-preservation. Education and youth organizations were another critical element of control. Schools were restructured to emphasize Nazi ideology, teaching loyalty, obedience, and racial superiority as central values. Textbooks were rewritten, teachers were monitored and required to support the regime, and students were enrolled in programs such as the Hitler Youth, where physical training, military drills, and ideological instruction prepared the next generation to serve the state unquestioningly. This early indoctrination ensured that loyalty to the regime became ingrained from a young age, shaping beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors before individuals fully matured into independent thinkers. The Nazis also implemented a network of local and regional authorities to extend their reach. Mayors, governors, and regional party leaders were loyal to Hitler, enforcing policies in towns, cities, and rural areas alike. Local offices coordinated law enforcement, social services, and labor programs, ensuring that the party's influence touched daily life, from ration cards to employment programs, from housing assignments to surveillance. Almost every interaction with the state reinforced the idea of the Nazi presence and authority. Control was further reinforced through intimidation and terror. The SA, or brown shirts, acted as street enforcers, breaking up opposition rallies, intimidating political rivals, and demonstrating the party's readiness to act decisively. Public displays of power, such as marches, rallies, and ceremonies, reinforced the sense of inevitability and dominance. Violence was strategic. It was used to suppress dissent, inspire fear, and remind citizens that the regime was uncompromising. Yet this was always combined with propaganda, which framed such actions as necessary for the protection of the nation, legitimizing even brutal measures in the eyes of supporters. The regime's surveillance apparatus extended into everyday life. Neighbors, co-workers, and even family members could report suspicious behavior. Informants and networks of party members ensured that no opposition could organize without detection. This created a society in which trust was eroded and self-monitoring became second nature. People were aware that their words, actions, and associations could have consequences, making conformity and outward loyalty the safest choice. Additionally, the Nazis controlled labor, industry, and social organizations. Independent unions were dissolved, replaced by the German Labor Front, which aligned workers' interests with state goals. Professional associations, cultural organizations, and clubs were either co-opted or disbanded. By integrating civil society into the party structure, the regime ensured that nearly every aspect of social life was regulated and monitored. Citizens could find security and advancement only by demonstrating loyalty, while dissenters were marginalized or punished. The Nazi machinery of control was also psychological. Fear was combined with rewards. Compliance brought safety, opportunity, and recognition, while defiance brought punishment. Propaganda reinforced this dual system, presenting the party as both protector and enforcer. Citizens were constantly reminded of the stakes, making obedience a rational and emotional response. Even those who disagreed with Nazi ideology often complied because the risks of opposition were too high. Religious institutions were another area of attention. The regime sought to influence or control churches, framing their role in ways that supported Nazi values. Clergy were monitored, religious teachings were scrutinized, and opposition from religious leaders was swiftly addressed through intimidation or legal action. By extending control into spiritual life, the Nazis further reinforced their dominance over the moral and cultural frameworks of the population. In short, the Nazi machinery of control was comprehensive, sophisticated, and multi-layered. It combined fear, propaganda, institutional dominance, surveillance, indoctrination, and strategic violence to create a society in which obedience became instinctive. This system allowed the regime to consolidate power rapidly, suppress dissent, and maintain control over a nation that was politically, economically, and socially complex. Understanding the machinery of control is essential for comprehending how the Nazis maintained authority, not only through elections or legislation, but through a pervasive system that penetrated nearly every aspect of life. It explains why opposition was so difficult, why propaganda was so effective, and how the regime could mobilize the population for both domestic control and the devastating ambitions of war. In Nazi Germany, controlling the population was not solely a matter of fear, law, or political maneuvering. Central to the regime's ability to dominate was the careful construction and dissemination of propaganda, combined with a cohesive and persuasive ideological framework. Propaganda and ideology were inseparable in the Nazi system. They shaped how people thought, felt, and acted, creating a society in which loyalty and conformity became second nature. Understanding this relationship is key to grasping how the regime maintained power, influenced society, and mobilized a nation for war and persecution. From the very beginning, Adolf Hitler and his inner circle recognized the power of media, symbols, and storytelling. Hitler himself was a master orator who understood that ideas could be more effectively conveyed through emotion than reason. Simple, repetitive messages, reinforced with dramatic imagery, could inspire loyalty, fear, or anger far more effectively than detailed policy discussions. This understanding became the foundation of Nazi propaganda, which sought to create a unified worldview in which the party's ideology seemed natural, inevitable, and morally justified. One of the most visible tools of propaganda was the swastika, which became an instantly recognizable symbol of Nazi ideology. Alongside flags, uniforms, and rallies, the symbol created a visual language of power, unity, and identity. Citizens encountering it in public spaces, workplaces, or schools were reminded of the regime's presence and authority. The repetition of these symbols in daily life reinforced the perception of Nazi dominance and inevitability, making the ideology not just an abstract belief system, but a tangible, omnipresent reality. Joseph Goebbels, as Minister of Propaganda, played a central role in coordinating this system. Goebbels understood the psychological aspects of persuasion, emphasizing emotional engagement over rational argument. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, films, and posters were carefully designed to appeal to pride, fear, resentment, and hope. Key messages emphasized national revival, the dangers of communism, and the threat posed by Jews and other groups labeled as enemies of the state. By controlling the flow of information, the Nazis were able to present themselves as the only solution to Germany's perceived problems, while demonizing opposition and dissent. Cultural propaganda was equally important. Literature, theater, and film were all harnessed to convey Nazi ideals. Filmmakers like Leni Riefenstahl produced works that glorified the regime, creating spectacles that combined artistry with political messaging. Music, art, and performance reinforced the myth of a powerful, unified Germany, while educational materials indoctrinated children with loyalty, obedience, and racial ideology. The regime's cultural dominance ensured that citizens were constantly exposed to a worldview aligned with Nazi objectives, blurring the line between entertainment, education, and political messaging. At the heart of Nazi propaganda was the construction of enemies. Jews, communists, and other marginalized groups were depicted as threats to Germany's survival and moral integrity. Anti-Semitism, which had deep historical roots in Europe, was amplified into a central ideological component, presenting Jews as both a social and political danger. Communists and other political opponents were framed as traitors, responsible for Germany's defeat in World War I and for the social and economic chaos of the Weimar Republic. By creating clear, identifiable enemies, the Nazis fostered unity, loyalty, and a sense of purpose among supporters. The regime also carefully manipulated language and messaging to shape perception. Terms like Führer, leader, and Volksgemeinschaft, people's community, were loaded with ideological meaning, creating emotional connections between the individual, the state, and the nation. Speeches, slogans, and written materials repeated these terms to reinforce loyalty and identity. The repetition of simple, emotionally resonant phrases made ideology accessible to broad segments of the population, ensuring that complex political and social ideas could be internalized quickly and deeply. Education and youth programs further reinforced propaganda. Schools were reorganized to emphasize racial theory, nationalism, and loyalty to Hitler. Subjects like history, biology, and physical education were infused with ideological messaging, teaching students to view the world through the lens of Nazi priorities. The Hitler Youth and League of German Girls created structured environments for ideological immersion, combining recreation, discipline, and instruction. Children were trained to internalize the regime's values from an early age, creating a generation of citizens who saw Nazi ideology not as optional, but as natural and inevitable. Propaganda extended into the workplace, public spaces, and social organizations. Citizens were encouraged to participate in rallies, community programs, and party-sponsored events. Volunteerism, public celebrations, and mass gatherings reinforced the perception of national unity and strength, while dissent was minimized through social pressure and surveillance. Even mundane aspects of life, such as the newspapers read in cafes or the songs sung at gatherings, became vehicles for ideological reinforcement, creating an environment in which ideology and daily existence were intertwined. The psychological effects of this propaganda cannot be overstated. By presenting a coherent narrative of national victimhood, moral duty, and inevitable victory, the Nazis shaped beliefs and behaviors. People came to see the party as the guardian of Germany, responsible for protecting citizens, restoring pride, and ensuring the survival of the nation. Propaganda made compliance and participation appear not only necessary, but virtuous, while opposition was portrayed as morally and politically dangerous. It's important to note that propaganda was not universally accepted without question. Resistance existed, from underground newspapers to individual acts of defiance, but the pervasiveness of messaging, combined with surveillance, fear, and social pressure, limited its effectiveness. The brilliance of Nazi propaganda lay not just in its content, but in its integration with other tools of control: legal authority, intimidation, and social engineering all reinforced the messages and made them credible, persuasive, and difficult to resist. In summary, propaganda and ideology were central pillars of Nazi power. Through symbols, media, education, culture, and carefully constructed messaging, the regime shaped perception, manipulated emotions, and created a society aligned with its goals. The integration of fear, reward, and identity made ideology not just a set of beliefs, but a lived experience, penetrating every aspect of life and ensuring that Nazi objectives could be implemented with minimal resistance. When the Nazis came to power, Germany was still reeling from the effects of the Great Depression. Unemployment was astronomical, reaching over 6 million people, and industrial output had plummeted. Many Germans were desperate for jobs, stability, and hope. Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party understood that economic recovery was not only crucial for national revival, but also essential for consolidating political support. They implemented a range of policies and public works programs designed to reduce unemployment, stimulate industry, and project the image of a government that could restore order and prosperity. One of the most visible aspects of Nazi economic policy was the public works program, which included massive infrastructure projects aimed at providing employment while modernizing the country. The most famous example is the construction of the Reichsautobahnen, or highways. These extensive road networks were designed to connect cities, facilitate trade, and improve military logistics. While they were undoubtedly practical, they were also highly symbolic, demonstrating the regime's capacity for planning, organization, and national improvement. Workers on these projects were given jobs, wages, and a sense of purpose, helping to stabilize families and communities that had been struggling for years. Alongside highways, the Nazis invested in other large-scale public works, including bridges, railways, government buildings, and stadiums. These projects not only created employment, but also showcased Germany's technological and organizational capabilities. Workers felt that they were contributing to something larger than themselves, a narrative carefully cultivated by the regime to foster loyalty and pride. The combination of tangible improvements in infrastructure and the ideological framing of these projects helped the Nazis embed themselves into everyday life. Economic recovery was also supported by state intervention in industry and labor. Independent labor unions were abolished and replaced by the German Labor Front, which coordinated employment, wages, and working conditions under the oversight of the state. While workers technically lost the right to strike or bargain independently, they gained stability, predictable income, and access to state-sponsored benefits. Industries were encouraged to align with state objectives, particularly in sectors like steel, armaments, and transportation, which were critical for both economic growth and the regime's broader ambitions. The Nazis also focused on rearmament and military-industrial expansion as a key driver of economic recovery. Though initially constrained by the Treaty of Versailles, Hitler prioritized rebuilding Germany's military capacity, creating jobs in arms manufacturing, engineering, and research. The emphasis on military preparedness provided both practical employment opportunities and a sense of national pride. Citizens saw visible results: ships, aircraft, and weapons being produced, and interpreted this as evidence that the government was restoring Germany's power and dignity on the global stage. Agricultural policy was another component of economic strategy. The regime implemented programs to stabilize farm prices, provide subsidies, and promote mechanization. Farmers, many of whom had struggled through years of depression and inflation, were reassured that the government would protect their livelihoods. This not only increased support for the Nazis in rural areas, but also helped stabilize food production, ensuring that urban centers could rely on domestic supply. Agriculture became a cornerstone of both economic planning and ideological messaging, linking productivity, self-sufficiency, and national pride. Consumer programs were introduced to foster loyalty among ordinary Germans. Initiatives like Strength Through Joy, Kraft durch Freude, KDF, provided leisure activities, vacations, and cultural events for workers, connecting material benefits to political allegiance. Cars, travel, concerts, and organized social events were presented as rewards for obedience and participation in the Nazi system. These programs helped create a sense of inclusion and personal stake in the regime, making economic improvement feel tied directly to loyalty and civic duty. Financial policies also played a role in consolidating support. The Nazis used a combination of deficit spending, credit expansion, and government contracts to stimulate employment and investment. Public-private partnerships ensured that industries aligned with state objectives benefited from funding and protection, creating a mutually reinforcing relationship between the regime and business interests. This combination of interventionist and strategic capitalist policies gave the impression of competence, planning, and success, further enhancing the regime's image. The impact of these policies on German society was profound. By the mid-1930s, unemployment had dropped significantly. Factories were producing at higher capacity, and infrastructure projects were visibly transforming the landscape. Citizens experienced both material improvements and psychological reassurance as the regime's promises of order, stability, and national revival seemed to be realized. Support for the Nazis grew as people connected tangible benefits to loyalty and participation in the state's programs. However, it's important to recognize that these economic policies were not simply benevolent. They were carefully calculated to tie citizens' welfare to the regime's authority, ensuring that personal prosperity was dependent on political compliance. Jobs, benefits, and social programs were conditional upon obedience and alignment with Nazi ideology. This created a subtle form of control. While the population experienced economic recovery, it also became increasingly enmeshed in a system where dissent carried significant risk. Another dimension of the Nazi economic strategy was its preparation for war. While the public faced the immediate benefits of jobs and infrastructure, the regime was also building an industrial base capable of supporting long-term military ambitions. Steel production, chemical manufacturing, and transportation networks were aligned with the eventual goal of expanding Germany's territory. Citizens, while benefiting from economic improvements, were also unknowingly contributing to the regime's broader ambitions, linking everyday labor and infrastructure to the vision of national power and dominance. In summary, Nazi economic policies and public works programs were a cornerstone of the regime's strategy to consolidate power. By providing employment, stabilizing industries, improving infrastructure, and linking benefits to loyalty, the Nazis created both tangible and psychological incentives for compliance. The combination of practical achievements and ideological framing allowed the regime to gain widespread support, making citizens feel invested in the state while subtly binding them to its authority. This economic dimension of control was not only effective in the short term, but also essential for enabling the broader social, political, and military ambitions that would define Nazi Germany. One of the defining features of Nazi Germany was its aggressive focus on militarization and rearmament, a cornerstone of both domestic policy and international ambition. After World War I, Germany had been severely restricted by the Treaty of Versailles, which limited the size of its army, banned certain weapons, and imposed strict conditions on its military capabilities. The Nazis viewed these restrictions as humiliating and unacceptable, framing rearmament not only as a matter of national defense, but as an essential step in reclaiming Germany's honor, sovereignty, and rightful place in the world. From the moment Hitler came to power, The regime prioritized rebuilding the military. This effort was both practical and symbolic. It provided employment, boosted national pride, and demonstrated that the government was capable of decisive action. Programs to expand the Army, Navy, and Air Force were implemented discreetly at first, avoiding direct confrontation with the Allied powers while building internal capacity. By the mid 1930s, Germany was openly violating the Versailles Treaty, introducing conscription, expanding the army beyond its allowed numbers, and developing weapons that had been explicitly forbidden, such as tanks and modern aircraft. The Wehrmacht, Germany's unified armed forces, became a key tool in this process. The Army, Navy, and Air Force were reorganized, modernized, and expanded under Nazi oversight. Leadership positions were filled with officers who were either sympathetic to the regime or could be relied upon to implement its objectives. Training programs emphasized discipline, obedience, and loyalty to the Führer, embedding political indoctrination alongside military expertise. Soldiers were taught to see themselves as part of a larger national mission, tasked not only with defense, but with the fulfillment of Hitler's vision of territorial expansion and racial supremacy. Rearmament was accompanied by a carefully managed propaganda campaign to glorify military service and frame Germany's military resurgence as a moral and national imperative. Parades, rallies, and media coverage celebrated the strength and discipline of the armed forces, while textbooks, films, and radio programs portrayed the military as a source of honor, pride, and unity. Citizens were encouraged to view service, weapons production, and support for the military as patriotic duties, creating a culture in which the armed forces were central to national identity. One of the most ambitious aspects of militarization was the expansion of air power, particularly the Luftwaffe. Under leaders like Hermann Göring, Germany invested heavily in modern aircraft, pilot training, and strategic development. Air power was not only a practical tool for future military campaigns, but also a symbol of technological advancement and a national revival. The visibility of air, shows, demonstrations, and exercises served as both propaganda and inspiration, making citizens feel that Germany was returning to a position of strength and modernity. The Navy, or Kriegsmarine, also received attention, with new ships constructed and naval strategies developed to expand Germany's maritime capabilities. This expansion served multiple purposes. It created jobs, stimulated industrial production, and projected the image of a nation capable of defending its interests and asserting influence on a global stage. The combined modernization of Army, Air Force, and Navy signaled Germany's return as a formidable military power, directly challenging the post-World War I order imposed by the Allies. Militarization extended beyond the professional armed forces. Organizations like the Hitler Youth and League of German Girls were designed to prepare young people for future military service. Boys learned physical training, basic combat skills, and ideological instruction, while girls were taught domestic skills aligned with racial and social goals. These programs created a pipeline of loyal, trained, and ideologically committed citizens who would later serve the state, ensuring that militarization was both generational and comprehensive. The economic dimension of rearmament was significant. The expansion of weapons production, infrastructure projects related to military logistics, and research into advanced technologies created millions of jobs and stimulated key sectors of the economy, industries producing steel, chemicals, vehicles, and machinery thrived under government contracts, linking economic recovery directly to the regime's militaristic ambitions. Citizens could see tangible results in the form of jobs, wages, and a visibly active industrial landscape, reinforcing support for the government's policies. Militarization was not only about preparing for war, it was also a tool of psychological control. The presence of uniforms, military parades, and disciplined troops in public spaces reinforced the perception of order, power, and inevitability. Citizens internalized the idea that the state was strong, competent, and capable of enforcing its will. Fear of military force, combined with propaganda glorifying the armed forces, created a society in which dissent seemed both dangerous and futile, while loyalty was rewarded with social prestige and material benefits. The ideological component of militarization was equally crucial. Nazi ideology framed military expansion as part of a broader historical struggle for racial survival and national destiny. Hitler presented Germany as a nation that had been humiliated, weakened, and constrained by external powers, and he argued that rearmament was necessary to reclaim its rightful place. Military strength was intertwined with notions of racial superiority, national unity, and destiny, creating a moral imperative for support that went beyond practical considerations. Militarization also enabled future strategic ambitions, including territorial expansion in Europe. By rebuilding and modernizing the armed forces, the Nazis positioned Germany to challenge neighboring countries, enforce ideological goals, and pursue aggressive policies without fear of immediate reprisal. The alignment of economic, ideological, and military priorities ensured that every aspect of society contributed to this goal, making militarization not just a military initiative, but a total societal project. By the late 1930s, the results of militarization were clear. Germany had transformed from a constrained, economically fragile state into a modern, industrialized, and increasingly militarized power. Citizens experienced the benefits of employment, infrastructure, and national pride, while simultaneously internalizing the authority and ideology of the regime. The combination of propaganda, indoctrination, and tangible progress ensured broad support, or at least compliance, and set the stage for the dramatic expansionist policies that would follow. Militarization and rearmament in Nazi Germany illustrate how economic, social, and ideological initiatives were intertwined with military objectives. The regime's ability to mobilize industry, workforce, and youth toward a coherent military and political goal demonstrated a level of planning and control that few contemporary societies had seen. By linking prosperity, pride, and national destiny to the expansion of the armed forces, the Nazis ensured that militarization was not only practical, but psychologically and socially compelling, making it a defining feature of the regime and a key factor in its rise to power. Once the Nazis consolidated power in 1933, it became immediately clear that maintaining control over Germany would require more than economic recovery, propaganda, and militarization. The regime faced both real and potential resistance from political opponents, independent institutions, and ordinary citizens who disagreed with their ideology or methods. To solidify authority, the Nazis implemented a comprehensive system of suppression and political repression, combining legal measures, intimidation, surveillance, and violence to eliminate opposition and instill fear across society. One of the first tools used to suppress dissent was the Reichstag Fire Decree, passed in February 1933. Following the burning of the Reichstag building, the Nazis claimed that communists were plotting to overthrow the government. Using this event as justification, the decree suspended civil liberties, including freedom of speech, assembly, and the press. Citizens could now be arrested without trial, and the police were granted extraordinary powers to monitor, interrogate, and detain individuals deemed enemies of the state. This legal framework provided a veneer of legitimacy to actions that effectively criminalized opposition. The Enabling Act of March 1933 further strengthened the regime's ability to repress dissent by granting Hitler and his cabinet the power to enact laws without parliamentary approval. The Nazis could override legal protections, restructure institutions, and implement policies that silenced opponents. Political parties outside of the Nazi Party were gradually outlawed, independent unions were dissolved, and regional governments were brought under central control. The legal system itself was reshaped to serve the regime, ensuring that those who resisted faced the full force of state authority. Violence played a crucial role in the suppression of opposition. The Sturmabteilung, SA, also known as the Brown Shirts, acted as street enforcers, disrupting meetings of rival political groups, intimidating voters, and demonstrating the Nazis' willingness to use force. They often targeted communists, socialists, and other perceived enemies, creating an environment in which public dissent was physically dangerous. This combination of legal authority and extrajudicial violence made resistance not only risky, but potentially lethal, discouraging organized opposition. The Gestapo, or secret state police, was central to surveillance and enforcement. Ordinary citizens were aware that the Gestapo could monitor behavior, interrogate suspected dissidents, and impose severe penalties. Informants were widespread, and neighbors, co-workers, or even family members could report anti-state activities. This culture of surveillance created psychological pressure, ensuring that many people internalized obedience and avoided activities that might draw attention, even if they privately disagreed with Nazi policies. The Schutzstaffel, SS, led by Heinrich Himmler, became the backbone of systematic political repression. Initially, Hitler's personal guard, the SS evolved into a highly organized force responsible for policing, intelligence, and enforcement of ideological conformity. They oversaw concentration camps, coordinated arrests, and ensured that all levels of society adhered to Nazi objectives. Members were rigorously trained, deeply indoctrinated, and unwaveringly loyal to Hitler, making the SS an effective instrument of both terror and administration. Concentration camps were an essential element of political repression. Initially, these camps held political prisoners, including communists, socialists, and trade unionists. Detainees were often subjected to harsh conditions, forced labor, and psychological intimidation. The camps served a dual purpose. They physically removed opponents from society and sent a clear message to the broader population about the consequences of resistance. Over time, the system expanded to include other groups, reflecting both the practical and ideological reach of Nazi repression. Cultural institutions and the press were also brought under strict control. Independent newspapers, journals, and publishers were shut down or absorbed into state-controlled outlets. Editors, writers, and journalists were monitored, and deviation from the official narrative could lead to arrest or loss of livelihood. By controlling information, the Nazis not only suppressed opposition, but also prevented alternative viewpoints from gaining traction. Citizens were exposed almost exclusively to propaganda aligned with Nazi ideology, creating a monopoly on public discourse. Education and professional organizations were similarly co-opted. Schools taught Nazi ideology alongside traditional subjects, instilling loyalty and obedience from an early age. Universities and professional associations were purged of dissenting voices, ensuring that intellectual and cultural leaders aligned with the regime's goals. Teachers, professors, and professionals who resisted were often dismissed, harassed, or imprisoned. By targeting institutions that shaped thought, the Nazis ensured that opposition was marginalized at both individual and societal levels. The suppression of opposition extended into private and social life. Citizens were encouraged to report suspicious behavior, creating a network of informal surveillance. Clubs, societies, and associations were brought under party oversight, and participation in state-approved organizations became both a social expectation and a requirement for advancement. Those who refused to conform faced isolation, harassment, or legal consequences. This pervasive system blurred the line between public and private life, making resistance socially and psychologically costly. The Night of the Long Knives in 1934 exemplified the regime's ruthless approach to consolidating power internally. Hitler ordered a purge of the SA leadership, along with other political rivals and perceived threats within the party. Dozens were executed without trial, including high-ranking officers and conservative opponents. This event sent a clear signal. No one, not even influential party members, was beyond the reach of repression. Loyalty and compliance were paramount, and challenges to authority were met with swift and decisive action. Political repression was not only reactive, but also preventive. By establishing a culture of fear, demonstrating consequences for dissent, and controlling the mechanisms of information and association, the Nazis reduced the likelihood of organized resistance. Citizens became conditioned to comply, self-censor, and participate in the state's programs, often blending voluntary support with fear-based submission. The psychological and social dimensions of repression were as critical as the legal and violent ones, creating a society in which opposition was extremely difficult. In summary, suppression of opposition and political repression were central to the Nazi strategy for maintaining power. Legal decrees, paramilitary violence, surveillance, concentration camps, and control of institutions combined to eliminate threats, intimidate the population, and foster a culture of obedience by integrating fear, propaganda, and social pressure. The regime ensured that resistance was not only risky, but psychologically daunting. This system of control allowed the Nazis to consolidate authority rapidly, enforce conformity, and implement their broader ideological and political goals with minimal organized opposition. A central component of Nazi ideology was a deeply entrenched belief in racial hierarchy, with Jews positioned as the ultimate enemy of Germany and the Aryan ideal. This ideology did not remain abstract. It became a system of state sanctioned discrimination, legal persecution, and social marginalization that shaped the lives of millions. Anti Semitic policies and racial laws were meticulously crafted and enforced to isolate, humiliate, and ultimately dehumanize Jews, creating a society in which exclusion and oppression were normalized. From the outset of Hitler's rise to power, Jews were scapegoated for Germany's social, economic, and political problems. Propaganda portrayed them as conspirators, responsible for both the perceived humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles and the instability of the Weimar Republic. This narrative was reinforced through newspapers, films, school curricula, and public speeches, creating a widely disseminated ideology of blame and distrust. The repeated messaging fostered social acceptance of discrimination and set the stage for formal legal measures. One of the first major steps in institutionalizing anti Semitism was the 1933 boycott of Jewish businesses. Coordinated across the nation, this boycott sought to economically isolate Jewish merchants while sending a clear public message about the regime's priorities. While the boycott was relatively short lived, it symbolized the beginning of systemic exclusion and demonstrated the state's willingness to interfere in daily economic life for ideological purposes. Citizens were encouraged to participate in the ostracism, reinforcing the idea that Jewish people were outsiders and threats to the national community. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935 marked a major escalation in legal discrimination. These laws formalized the racial hierarchy promoted by the Nazis, defining who was considered Jewish and stripping them of basic citizenship rights. Jews were prohibited from marrying or having sexual relations with Aryans, and they were excluded from many professions, including government positions, education, and the military. These laws were highly detailed and bureaucratic, reflecting the regime's methodical approach to codifying racial ideology. By embedding racism into the legal system, the Nazis ensured that discrimination was not only socially enforced, but also officially sanctioned, creating barriers that were difficult to challenge or evade. Education played a key role in reinforcing these laws and racial ideology. Schools were tasked with teaching children about racial purity, emphasizing the supposed superiority of Aryans and the dangers posed by Jews and other marginalized groups. Textbooks were rewritten to incorporate pseudoscientific theories of race, often presenting these ideas as objective truths. Students were immersed in this worldview from an early age, learning that loyalty to the regime included adherence to these racial principles. Over time, these lessons shaped not only knowledge, but moral perception, conditioning children to accept systemic discrimination as natural and justified. Anti Semitic policies extended into public life and social interaction. Jews were gradually excluded from theaters, parks, restaurants, and other public spaces. Signs indicated Jews not welcome, and social ostracism became widespread. This segregation reinforced the perception that Jewish people were outsiders and threats to the national community. Even everyday interactions were monitored, with neighbors encouraged to report violations of racial laws, further isolating Jews socially and psychologically. Employment restrictions further marginalized Jewish citizens. Jews were systematically removed from public service, teaching, medicine, and law. Certain professional organizations prohibited Jewish membership, limiting opportunities for economic stability and advancement. These measures were both punitive and symbolic, demonstrating that the regime controlled access to social and economic life and that Jewish people were no longer considered equal members of society. Propaganda was a continuous tool in reinforcing anti-Semitic policies. Newspapers, posters, and films depicted Jews as morally corrupt, dangerous, or conspiratorial. Stereotypes were amplified to create fear, distrust, and resentment, encouraging non-Jewish Germans to accept or even support discriminatory measures. Propaganda emphasized that Jews were responsible for economic hardship, political instability, and cultural decay, making persecution appear both rational and necessary. The regime also implemented registration and identification systems to track Jewish citizens. Identification cards, censuses, and other bureaucratic tools were used to monitor movements, enforce restrictions, and prepare for further measures of control. These systems made it difficult for Jews to evade discrimination or maintain a sense of autonomy, reinforcing the totalizing reach of the state. Religious life was affected as well. Jewish schools, synagogues, and community organizations faced restrictions or closure. Religious practice became increasingly constrained, while interfaith interactions were monitored or discouraged. The intent was to separate Jewish culture from public life and ensure that every aspect of daily experience reflected the racial policies of the regime. The escalating marginalization culminated in increasingly severe persecution in the late 1930s, including Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass. In November 1938, synagogues were burned, Jewish businesses were destroyed, homes were ransacked, and thousands of Jews were arrested and sent to concentration camps. This state-sponsored violence marked a clear escalation from legal and social discrimination to organized physical persecution, signaling that anti-Semitic policy was moving from segregation towards systematic eradication. The combination of laws, social exclusion, propaganda, and violence created a climate in which Jewish citizens were stripped of rights, dignity, and security. Anti-Semitic policies were not isolated acts, but part of a coordinated system designed to normalize discrimination, enforce ideological conformity, and prepare society for increasingly radical measures. Ordinary Germans were made to participate, comply, or observe, embedding prejudice and fear into the fabric of daily life. Anti-Semitic policies also served broader political purposes. By presenting Jews as the common enemy, the Nazis fostered national unity among non-Jewish Germans, deflecting attention from economic hardship or political instability. Scapegoating created cohesion through division, making loyalty to the state both a moral and social expectation. Citizens were given clear instructions about who was outside the community, making compliance easier and resistance less likely. In summary, anti-Semitic policies and racial laws were a central pillar of Nazi ideology and governance. Through legal frameworks, social exclusion, propaganda, education, and orchestrated violence, the regime systematically marginalized Jewish citizens, embedding discrimination into daily life and preparing society for even more radical persecution. This combination of ideological indoctrination, legal codification, and psychological manipulation illustrates how deeply anti Semitism was institutionalized and normalized in Nazi Germany, making it one of the most devastating components of the regime's control over society. In Nazi Germany, control over the minds of the next generation was just as important as control over the present. Adolf Hitler and his regime understood that to ensure the longevity of their ideology, they needed to shape children from a young age, instilling loyalty, obedience, and belief in racial superiority. Education and youth programs became central instruments of indoctrination, creating a generation whose identity, worldview, and behavior aligned with the goals of the Nazi state. The first step was restructuring schools. Traditional curricula were rewritten to reflect Nazi ideology, transforming every subject into a tool for shaping political and racial consciousness. History classes emphasized Germany's supposed victimization by the Treaty of Versailles, glorified the nation's military past, and highlighted the perceived threats posed by Jews and communists. Geography and biology were infused with racial theory, teaching students to view the world in terms of racial hierarchies and the natural superiority of the Aryan race. Even mathematics and literature were adapted to include nationalistic examples and moral lessons aligned with the party's goals. Teachers were not passive transmitters of knowledge but active agents of ideological enforcement. Educators were carefully vetted for loyalty to the regime, and those who resisted or were deemed politically unreliable were dismissed or arrested. Teachers were encouraged, and in many cases compelled, to participate in Nazi organizations, attend political training, and ensure that classroom content reinforced party doctrine. The profession itself became a mechanism for social and political control as students absorbed lessons not only from textbooks, but from the attitudes and behaviors of their instructors. The regime also targeted higher education. Universities were purged of professors, researchers, and staff who did not align with Nazi ideology. Fields like law, medicine, and science were transformed to reflect racial policies, military priorities, and state objectives. Students were required to demonstrate loyalty to the party, and dissenting views were suppressed. Research and scholarship were expected to support the state, whether through studies in genetics, military technology, or propaganda-related social sciences. By controlling higher education, the Nazis ensured that future leaders, scientists, and professionals were both skilled and ideologically compliant. Beyond formal schooling, the Hitler Youth, Hitlerjugend, became the cornerstone of youth indoctrination. Boys between the ages of 10 and 18 were trained in physical fitness, military skills, and ideological education. Activities included marching, camping, firearms training, and paramilitary exercises, combined with lessons emphasizing obedience, loyalty to Hitler, and devotion to the German nation. The program cultivated discipline, camaraderie, and a sense of purpose, presenting military readiness and national service as both exciting and morally obligatory. For girls, the League of German Girls, Bund Deutscher Medal, emphasized physical health, domestic skills, and racial education. Girls were trained to embody Nazi ideals of motherhood, domesticity, and racial responsibility. They learned cooking, childcare, sewing, and home management. But these lessons were framed as patriotic duties, with the goal of producing future mothers who would raise loyal Aryan children. Outdoor activities, sports, and ideological instruction reinforced the message that girls had a critical role in sustaining the Nazi vision through family and society. Membership in these organizations was initially voluntary, but increasingly mandatory after 1936. The regime ensured that children who resisted were socially ostracized or faced disciplinary measures. Participation became not just a privilege, but a requirement for social acceptance, educational advancement, and future career opportunities. Through these programs, the state controlled not only children's activities, but also their social networks, peer relationships, and leisure time, creating a comprehensive system of influence. Education and youth indoctrination also relied heavily on ritual, ceremony, and symbolism. Uniforms, flags, salutes, and oaths reinforced group identity and loyalty to the Führer. Mass rallies and local events created a sense of belonging, collective purpose, and pride in participation. Even leisure activities were imbued with ideological significance, ensuring that fun and play were inseparable from political and moral instruction. The psychological effect was profound. Children internalized loyalty, discipline, and ideological beliefs as part of their daily lives, often without conscious awareness of manipulation. Propaganda extended into cultural and recreational programming. Literature, films, songs, and plays were curated to teach Nazi ideals. Stories emphasized heroism, sacrifice for the nation, racial purity, and loyalty to Hitler. Popular media reinforced lessons from school and youth programs, creating a consistent and immersive ideological environment. By controlling the stories children consumed, the regime shaped both moral understanding and emotional engagement, making ideology a lived experience rather than an abstract concept. The integration of physical, intellectual, and social education ensured that Nazi indoctrination was holistic. Children were not only taught what to think, but how to behave, interact, and perceive the world. Physical training prepared them for military service. Intellectual instruction shaped their beliefs and reasoning, and social programming influenced their relationships, aspirations, and sense of identity. The result was a generation deeply enmeshed in the values, priorities, and worldview of the regime. The impact of this system was significant. By the late 1930s, the majority of German youth were either formally enrolled in Nazi organizations or heavily influenced by state-controlled schooling and social programs. This created a generation that internalized loyalty to Hitler, adherence to racial ideology, and the normalization of authoritarian control. For the regime, this was a critical investment in long-term stability and ideological continuity, ensuring that Nazi values would persist even as political and military circumstances evolved. In summary, education and youth indoctrination were central to the Nazi strategy of control. Schools, universities, and youth organizations were transformed into instruments of ideological training, blending academic instruction, physical development, socialization, and propaganda. By shaping children from an early age, the regime ensured the internalization of loyalty, obedience, and racial ideology, producing citizens who were prepared to support, participate in, and perpetuate the goals of Nazi Germany. Propaganda in Nazi Germany was not confined to speeches, rallies, or political publications. It infiltrated every aspect of everyday life. The regime understood that controlling information and shaping perception required saturation, ensuring that citizens were constantly exposed to messages reinforcing Nazi ideology, values, and priorities. From newspapers and radio to posters, films, and even social etiquette, propaganda became an omnipresent force designed to mold thought, behavior, and social norms. The Ministry of Propaganda, led by Joseph Goebbels, orchestrated this pervasive influence. Goebbels recognized that effective propaganda was not just about spreading facts or directives, it was about appealing to emotion, shaping identity, and creating narratives that felt natural and inevitable. His approach relied on repetition, symbolism, and the careful selection of both content and tone. By controlling nearly all forms of media, the regime could maintain a monopoly on information, ensuring that citizens received consistent messages aligned with Nazi goals. Newspapers were a primary tool for daily ideological reinforcement. Independent presses were either shut down or brought under Nazi control, leaving citizens with newspapers that presented carefully curated stories, editorials, and images. Reporting emphasized national pride, achievements of the regime, and the dangers posed by enemies, both domestic and foreign. Stories often blended truth, exaggeration, and outright fabrication, designed to evoke emotional responses rather than rational analysis. Headlines painted the Nazi Party as the savior of Germany, while opponents and marginalized groups were depicted as threats to social, moral, and economic stability. The radio was equally transformative. Recognizing its accessibility, the Nazis produced affordable radios called the Volksempfänger, or People's Receiver, ensuring that propaganda could reach households across the country. Radio broadcasts included speeches by Hitler, music, news, and educational programs, all framed to support ideological objectives. Families and communities gathered around the radio, creating both a shared cultural experience and a consistent point of exposure to state messaging. The immediacy and emotional power of the spoken word allowed the regime to reinforce loyalty and normalize its worldview in daily life. Film became a sophisticated vehicle for propaganda, combining storytelling, spectacle, and ideology. Movies like Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will showcased mass rallies, military power, and the grandeur of the Nazi Party, conveying messages of unity, strength, and inevitability. Other films incorporated anti-Semitic or nationalistic narratives, shaping perceptions subtly through entertainment. Cinema created immersive experiences where audiences were emotionally engaged, internalizing ideological messages without overt instruction. Posters, billboards, and public signage ensured that propaganda was unavoidable in physical space. Streets, Train stations, schools, and workplaces were decorated with symbols, slogans, and images designed to instill pride, fear, or compliance. Even everyday objects, such as calendars or matchbooks, could carry subtle messaging reinforcing Nazi values. The visual saturation created a constant reminder of the state's presence, authority, and worldview, making obedience and alignment with ideology a default expectation. Propaganda extended into social norms and etiquette. Citizens were taught how to behave publicly, whom to trust, and what opinions to express. Celebrations, ceremonies, and rituals reinforced party ideology, embedding loyalty in cultural practice. Public displays of allegiance, such as the Hitler salute or participation in national holidays, became expected, creating social pressure to conform. Individuals internalized these behaviors, often performing them automatically, blending genuine belief with the practical need for acceptance and safety. Education and youth programs were closely tied to media propaganda. Children were exposed to films, radio programs, and printed materials that reinforced lessons learned in school and youth organizations. Literature, plays, and music were curated to highlight themes of racial purity, obedience, and nationalism. By integrating propaganda into recreation and entertainment, the regime ensured that exposure to ideology was continuous, engaging, and emotionally resonant. Propaganda was also used to normalize persecution and discrimination. Visual and verbal messaging portrayed Jews, communists, and other targeted groups as threats to society, health, and morality. Caricatures, films, and news stories presented these groups as subversive, corrupt, or dangerous, conditioning citizens to accept, participate in, or ignore their marginalization. Over time, constant exposure created a shared perception in which discrimination appeared natural, justified, and necessary for the survival of the nation. The psychological power of everyday propaganda lay in its integration and consistency. Messages were not isolated, they were reinforced across multiple channels, repeated daily, and aligned with laws, social expectations, and public events. Citizens experienced propaganda as part of the rhythm of life, making ideology inseparable from routine, relationships, and identity. People were influenced not only by the content, but by the perceived consensus and the constant presence of the state in thought, speech, and social interaction. Mass media also served strategic political purposes. By controlling information, the Nazis could suppress dissent, shape perceptions of domestic and international events, and mobilize support for policies ranging from economic initiatives to military campaigns. Crises, victories, and ideological campaigns were framed to maintain morale, reinforce loyalty, and justify actions, ensuring that citizens interpreted events through the lens of party priorities. Even humor and popular culture were not immune. Cartoons, jokes, and songs were employed to ridicule enemies, celebrate the regime, and reinforce ideological narratives. These forms of entertainment reinforced messages subtly, shaping beliefs and attitudes without overt instruction, making propaganda both engaging and persistent. In summary, propaganda in everyday life and mass media was a cornerstone of Nazi control. By saturating households, schools, workplaces, and public spaces with consistent messaging. The regime created an environment in which ideology became inseparable from daily experience. Newspapers, radio, film, visual symbols, social norms, and entertainment all worked together to shape perception, influence behavior, and normalize loyalty, obedience, and discrimination. This comprehensive approach ensured that citizens were constantly engaged with Nazi ideology, creating a society in which thought, action, and identity were carefully aligned with the state's objectives. A crucial element of Nazi Germany's ability to maintain control and suppress dissent was the creation of a comprehensive police state built around organizations like the SS, Schutzstaffel, and the Gestapo, Geheime Staatspolizei, or secret state police. These institutions were designed to monitor, intimidate, and punish any form of opposition, ensuring that fear, loyalty, and obedience became central to daily life. The SS and Gestapo were not isolated units. They were part of an integrated system of surveillance, enforcement, and repression that reached into virtually every aspect of German society. The SS, initially formed as Hitler's personal bodyguard, rapidly evolved into one of the most powerful institutions in the Reich. Led by Heinrich Himmler, the SS became an elite organization responsible for a wide array of functions, from policing and intelligence to the administration of concentration camps. Members were carefully selected, rigorously trained, and ideologically indoctrinated to ensure unwavering loyalty. The SS's influence expanded far beyond its original protective role, making it both a symbol of Nazi authority and a practical instrument of state control. One of the SS's primary responsibilities was internal security. This included monitoring political activity, enforcing party loyalty, and coordinating with other branches of the regime to identify and neutralize threats. SS officers were embedded in key institutions, including law enforcement, judiciary, and local administration, giving them broad reach and influence. Their presence reinforced the idea that the state could penetrate every level of society, leaving citizens aware that their actions, associations, and even thoughts could be scrutinized. The Gestapo, the secret state police, was the operational arm of surveillance and repression. Unlike ordinary police, the Gestapo operated with virtually unlimited authority. They could arrest citizens without due process, detain individuals indefinitely, and interrogate suspected opponents using both intimidation and violence. Citizens quickly learned that loyalty was not optional. Any perceived criticism of the regime, deviation from prescribed norms, or contact with opposition groups could result in severe consequences. The Gestapo's effectiveness relied not only on its operational power, but also on the climate of fear it created, ensuring that many people self-censored and conformed. The integration of the SS and Gestapo into the broader police state allowed for a level of coordination and efficiency that made resistance extremely difficult. These organizations worked closely with local party officials, informants, and civilian surveillance networks to monitor behavior, identify potential threats, and enforce conformity. By combining formal authority with social pressure, the regime ensured that opposition could be detected quickly, neutralized efficiently, and used as a warning to the broader population. Concentration camps were another tool through which the SS enforced control. Initially established for political prisoners, these camps became centers of terror, punishment, and forced labor. The SS administered the camps, overseeing detainees, enforcing discipline, and implementing policies of dehumanization. The existence of these camps sent a clear signal. Those who resisted or were deemed undesirable would face not only social ostracism, but also extreme physical and psychological consequences. This system reinforced compliance among the general population, as the consequences of dissent were both visible and extreme. Surveillance extended into private life. Citizens were encouraged to report suspicious behavior among neighbors, co-workers, and even family members. Informants were ubiquitous, and the fear of betrayal created an environment in which self-monitoring became second nature. Ordinary interactions, casual conversations, and public expressions of opinion were all potentially monitored, reinforcing obedience and discouraging opposition. The psychological impact of knowing that any action could be reported was as powerful as the physical mechanisms of repression. The SS also played a critical role in implementing racial policies. Officers coordinated the identification, registration, and eventual deportation of Jews, Romani people, and other targeted groups. The SS's control over both the police apparatus and the concentration camp system enabled the regime to execute racial policies systematically, efficiently, and with minimal public resistance. These operations were tightly bureaucratized, emphasizing order, documentation, and procedural authority, which gave a veneer of legitimacy to acts of extreme persecution. Legal and bureaucratic measures reinforced the power of the SS and Gestapo. Courts, judges, and local authorities were aligned with the police state, ensuring that arrests, detentions, and punishments were executed without obstacle. The judiciary was often complicit, providing legal cover for what were essentially extrajudicial actions. This integration of law, bureaucracy, and enforcement created a comprehensive system in which resistance was not only dangerous, but institutionally unsanctioned. Propaganda supported the operations of the SS and Gestapo. Citizens were encouraged to perceive these organizations as guardians of national security, protecting the population from internal and external threats. The combination of fear, legitimacy, and social pressure made compliance more likely. People internalized the message that loyalty, vigilance, and reporting were not just encouraged, but morally necessary, reinforcing the reach and effectiveness of the police state. The SS and Gestapo were also symbolically powerful. Uniforms, rituals, salutes, and public displays of authority reinforced the perception of strength, discipline, and inevitability. Citizens encountered these symbols in daily life, from street patrols to public events, creating constant reminders of the regime's power. This visual and psychological presence ensured that obedience was habitual, often performed without conscious thought, as individuals internalized both fear and respect for the institutions enforcing control. The police state also served practical political purposes by maintaining surveillance, enforcing compliance, and suppressing dissent. The SS and Gestapo enabled the regime to implement ambitious economic, military, and ideological programs without significant internal resistance. Citizens were monitored, manipulated, and guided to align with state objectives, ensuring that resources, labor, and social participation could be directed toward the broader goals of the Nazi Party. In summary, the SS, Gestapo, and the broader police state were essential to Nazi control. Through a combination of surveillance, intimidation, legal authority, and social pressure, these institutions created a climate in which obedience, loyalty, and compliance became central to survival. Their reach extended into every aspect of society, from public institutions to private life, ensuring that opposition was quickly neutralized and that citizens internalized both fear and allegiance. The police state exemplified the totalizing nature of Nazi power, demonstrating how political authority, ideology, and repression could be integrated into a system capable of dominating a population with extraordinary efficiency. In Nazi Germany, women were seen as central to the regime's vision of the future, not as independent political actors, but as vital instruments in building and sustaining the Aryan state. The Nazis' policies regarding women and families were deeply ideological, tied to notions of racial purity, national renewal, and population growth. These policies were designed to shape women's roles, influence family structures, and integrate domestic life into the broader objectives of the state. The regime promoted a very specific ideal of womanhood, centered on three main roles: motherhood, homemaking, and moral guidance. Women were expected to prioritize family above personal ambition or professional achievement, nurturing children who would grow up to be loyal, healthy, and ideologically aligned citizens. The slogan, Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church, summarized this vision, emphasizing domesticity, fertility, and moral duty as central to women's identities. This model served both practical and ideological purposes, ensuring that family life became a vehicle for the reproduction of Nazi values. To encourage motherhood, the Nazis implemented a series of financial incentives and awards. The Mother's Cross, for example, was a medal awarded to women who bore multiple children, with distinctions for 4, 6, or more offspring. Families with large numbers of children received bonuses, tax relief, and preferential access to housing and employment opportunities. These incentives reinforced the message that childbearing was not only a personal duty, but also a patriotic act, directly contributing to the strength and continuity of the nation. Employment policies reflected this ideology as well. Women were discouraged from working outside the home, particularly in professional and managerial roles. Jobs in education, medicine, law, and civil service were increasingly restricted, and social pressure was applied to ensure that women would leave the workforce upon marriage or childbirth. The intent was to redirect energy and attention toward family and domestic responsibilities, aligning personal life with the regime's demographic and ideological goals. Education for girls was similarly tailored to support these objectives. Schools emphasized home economics, childcare, and physical health, alongside lessons in Nazi ideology and racial theory. Girls were taught the importance of racial purity, the duties of motherhood, and the moral obligations of raising children in accordance with party principles. The League of German Girls, Bund Deutscher Medal, provided a structured environment in which physical training, outdoor activities, and ideological instruction reinforced these lessons. Participation in such programs ensured that young women internalized the values, expectations, and roles prescribed by the regime. Family life was framed as both a personal and political endeavor. Marriage was promoted as a patriotic duty, and ceremonies often included rituals and symbolism emphasizing loyalty to the nation and racial continuity. Couples were encouraged to plan families according to state guidelines, and fertility was celebrated as a form of civic contribution. The regime's messaging created a culture in which personal fulfillment, social recognition, and moral standing were closely tied to adherence to these prescribed family roles. Public health policies were also used to enforce ideological goals. Programs promoting prenatal care, maternal health, and child welfare were implemented not purely for humanitarian reasons, but to ensure that children were born and raised healthy and fit for future service to the state. Simultaneously, the regime actively discouraged reproduction among those deemed racially or genetically undesirable, including individuals with disabilities or those outside the Aryan racial ideal. This combination of encouragement and restriction reflected the Nazis' eugenic goals, integrating women's reproductive roles directly into the broader racial agenda. Propaganda played a key role in shaping perceptions of women's roles. Posters, films, and literature celebrated motherhood, family loyalty, and domestic virtue. Women were depicted as moral guardians, keepers of the home, and transmitters of racial and ideological values. At the same time, working women, feminists, or those who resisted these roles were portrayed negatively as selfish, misguided, or even dangerous to the national community. The imagery reinforced both pride in fulfilling these roles and social pressure to conform. Marriage and family policies were supported by legal measures. Laws discouraged divorce, promoted early marriage, and incentivized childbirth through tax benefits and social recognition. Organizations like the National Socialist Women's League provided resources, training, and guidance for domestic management, reinforcing the notion that women's primary contributions were through family and household work. The alignment of law, social programs, and ideology ensured that women's personal choices were shaped, directed, and monitored in accordance with state objectives. The regime also leveraged youth and community programs to integrate women into national life. Women were expected to mentor younger girls, participate in community initiatives, and support the activities of youth organizations. This extended their influence beyond the household, making them active participants in transmitting ideology and sustaining social cohesion. At the same time, it reinforced the regime's reach into private life, blurring the line between personal and political responsibility. While these policies were framed as empowering women within their roles, in practice, they restricted autonomy and limited personal freedom. Careers, education, and personal aspirations were subordinated to the state's vision, and social pressure reinforced compliance. Women who resisted faced ostracism, social criticism, or legal penalties, while those who conformed were rewarded with recognition, material benefits, and a sense of social prestige. This system of incentives and constraints created a population aligned with the regime's demographic and ideological goals. In summary, women and family policies in Nazi Germany were carefully designed to serve the broader objectives of the regime by emphasizing motherhood, domesticity, racial purity, and ideological loyalty. The state integrated women's roles into its vision of national renewal. Education, propaganda, financial incentives, and social pressure reinforced these expectations, shaping both behavior and identity. Women were positioned as vital instruments in sustaining the Aryan population, transmitting ideology, and supporting the social and political order, demonstrating how deeply the personal and domestic spheres were harnessed for state objectives. By the mid 1930s, Nazi Germany had not only rebuilt its military, but was also prepared to pursue an ambitious agenda of territorial expansion. Military campaigns were central to Hitler's vision of Lebensraum, or living space, which sought to secure additional territory for the German people while establishing dominance over Europe. These campaigns combined tactical innovation, overwhelming coordination, and ideological motivation, creating a period of rapid conquest that shocked the world. The first major act of aggression came with the remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936. This strategically important region had been demilitarized under the Treaty of Versailles, but German troops entered without facing significant opposition from France or Britain. The move was carefully calculated. It tested the resolve of the Allied powers while bolstering national pride and confidence within Germany. The successful remilitarization demonstrated both strategic boldness and the effectiveness of psychological warfare, signaling that Hitler was willing to defy international constraints while carefully avoiding immediate conflict. Following this, Germany pursued a policy of political and military unification with Austria, known as the Anschluss. In 1938, Austrian leaders were pressured, intimidated, and coerced into alignment with the Reich, and German troops moved in with minimal resistance. The Anschluss was framed as the liberation and unification of German-speaking peoples, appealing to nationalist sentiment and reinforcing the narrative of Germany's historical and cultural destiny. It also provided strategic and economic advantages, expanding territory, resources, and military positioning without the costs of large-scale warfare. In parallel, Germany intensified pressure on Czechoslovakia, particularly the Sudetenland, where a significant German-speaking population resided. Hitler's claims were framed around self-determination and the protection of ethnic Germans. But the broader aim was territorial acquisition and strategic advantage. The Munich Agreement of 1938 allowed Germany to annex the Sudetenland without direct military confrontation, showcasing the effectiveness of diplomacy backed by the threat of force. This expansion further emboldened Hitler, solidified Germany's regional influence, and demonstrated the weaknesses of appeasement policies among European powers. The invasion of Poland in 1939 marked the first large-scale military campaign of World War II and triggered the global conflict. Germany employed a strategy known as Blitzkrieg, or lightning war, which emphasized speed, coordination, and combined arms tactics. Tanks, mechanized infantry, and air support worked in tandem to overwhelm Polish defenses, achieve rapid territorial gains, and create psychological shock among both military personnel and civilians. The campaign was devastatingly effective, and within weeks, Poland was divided between Germany and the Soviet Union under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, demonstrating both strategic calculation and operational efficiency. Following Poland, Germany launched a series of rapid conquests in Western Europe, beginning with the invasion of Denmark and Norway in 1940, securing access to strategic ports, natural resources, and shipping routes. These operations were executed with precision, often relying on surprise, coordination, and pre-planned logistics to minimize resistance. The campaigns reflected the emphasis on speed and tactical innovation, hallmarks of Nazi military planning. The fall of France in 1940 remains one of the most remarkable military achievements of early Nazi expansion. Using blitzkrieg tactics, German forces bypassed the heavily fortified Maginot Line, advancing through Belgium and the Ardennes forest. Within 6 weeks, France surrendered, and the occupation demonstrated the effectiveness of Germany's combined military strategies. The victory was not only a strategic triumph, but also a massive propaganda success, reinforcing the image of German military invincibility and fueling domestic pride and support for the regime. Meanwhile, the Battle of Britain tested Germany's ability to project air power and achieve control over the skies. Despite sustained attacks by the Luftwaffe, Britain's Royal Air Force resisted, preventing a German invasion. The campaign highlighted both the strengths and limitations of German military strategy, demonstrating that even the most technologically advanced and well-coordinated forces could encounter significant challenges. It also underscored the psychological dimension of warfare, as air raids aimed to break civilian morale, while simultaneously testing the limits of national resolve. In the Balkans, Germany launched campaigns in Yugoslavia and Greece in 1941, securing strategic positions in Southeast Europe. These operations involved careful coordination of ground and air forces, rapid maneuvers, and the suppression of local resistance. Success in the Balkans further secured Germany's southern flank and allowed for the subsequent launch of Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union. The speed and coordination of these campaigns reflected the continued emphasis on tactical innovation, logistical planning, and psychological impact on both enemy forces and civilian populations. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, represented the largest military campaign in history at that point, combining millions of soldiers, thousands of tanks, and extensive air support. The campaign aimed to seize territory, eliminate perceived ideological threats, and secure critical resources. Initial advances were rapid and devastating, resulting in massive territorial gains and significant destruction. However, logistical challenges, extreme weather, and determined Soviet resistance eventually slowed the advance, highlighting the limits of even the most meticulously planned campaigns. Throughout these military operations, ideology and propaganda played an essential role. Soldiers were motivated not only by orders, but by the belief that they were fighting for Germany's survival, racial destiny, and historical mission. Propaganda reinforced narratives of heroism, duty, and the moral imperative to expand the Reich. Civilian populations were also subjected to messaging designed to normalize occupation, encourage collaboration, and justify German authority. These campaigns also had profound economic and social effects. Occupied territories were exploited for resources, labor, and strategic advantage. German industries and military forces relied on the extraction of materials, the imposition of forced labor, and the restructuring of local economies to support ongoing war efforts. The expansion created both opportunity and logistical complexity, as the regime needed to balance military conquest with administrative control and resource management. In summary, German military campaigns and expansion were central to the early successes of the Nazi regime, combining strategic innovation, rapid execution, and ideological motivation. These operations reshaped Europe and demonstrated the effectiveness of blitzkrieg tactics from the Rhineland to Poland, France, and the Soviet Union. Germany's campaigns were not just military maneuvers, they were carefully orchestrated tools of political, psychological, and economic control. By linking conquest with ideology, the regime ensured that expansion reinforced national pride, loyalty, and the narrative of historical destiny, setting the stage for the vast and destructive scale of World War II. Among all the events of the Second World War, none carries the same moral and historical weight as the Holocaust. The systematic, state-sponsored extermination of 6 million Jews, along with millions of others, deemed undesirable by the Nazi regime. It stands as one of the darkest chapters in human history, not only for its immense scale, but for the bureaucratic precision, ideological fervor, and chilling normality with which it was executed. The roots of the Holocaust were deeply embedded in Nazi ideology. From the earliest years of Hitler's political rise, anti-Semitism was central to the movement's worldview. Jews were portrayed as a racial enemy, accused of undermining the nation from within and manipulating global politics for their own benefit. This myth, presented as scientific truth through racial theory and propaganda, provided the justification for exclusion, persecution, and ultimately extermination. The process began gradually with the Nazis' consolidation of power. In 1933, Jews were systematically removed from public life. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935 codified racial discrimination, defining who was considered Jewish and stripping them of citizenship, legal rights, and access to professions. Marriages and relationships between Jews and non-Jews were forbidden. Businesses were confiscated or forced into Aryan ownership. Step by step, Jewish communities were isolated from the rest of society. Propaganda made this persecution visible and acceptable. Newspapers, films, and radio broadcasts repeated narratives portraying Jews as enemies of the state. Posters depicted grotesque caricatures linking Jewish identity with corruption and moral decay. These images and stories were designed to dehumanize, turning neighbors into outsiders and suspicion into moral duty. Over time, discrimination became normalized, woven into daily life through education, law, and cultural messaging. When Germany began its territorial expansion, persecution evolved into something even more systematic. In occupied Poland and other territories, ghettos were established to confine Jewish populations under harsh and degrading conditions. Cities like Warsaw, Łódź, and Krakow saw entire communities walled off, deprived of adequate food, sanitation, and medical care. These ghettos became holding areas, stages in a process that would lead to mass deportation and death. Parallel to these developments, the regime began to target other groups considered undesirable: the disabled, Romani people, political dissidents, homosexuals, and members of religious minorities were persecuted and often killed. The so-called T4 euthanasia program marked an early step toward mass killing, as doctors and administrators were instructed to eliminate those deemed unfit for life. The methods developed: gas chambers disguised as showers, bureaucratic record keeping, and the rationalization of murder as efficiency, would later be expanded on a far larger scale. The invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 marked a turning point. Behind advancing German armies followed Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units tasked with eliminating Jews, political commissars, and other perceived enemies. Entire communities were executed in fields, ravines, and forests. Tens of thousands were murdered in places like Babi Yar and Ponary. These massacres represented both the escalation of genocidal policy and the psychological normalization of mass murder within military and police structures. Out of these operations emerged the decision for what the Nazis called the final solution to the Jewish question. At the Wannsee Conference in January 1942, senior officials coordinated plans for the industrialized extermination of Europe's Jewish population. This meeting did not invent genocide. It organized it, transforming ideology into administrative procedure. The killing would no longer be sporadic or localized. It would be systematic, coordinated across occupied Europe, and executed with chilling precision. To carry out this plan, the regime established a network of concentration and extermination camps. Sites such as Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Majdanek, and Chelmno became the centers of mass killing. Deportation trains transported Jews from across the continent, often under the pretense of resettlement. Upon arrival, victims were subjected to selection. Those deemed fit for labor were sent to work under brutal conditions. The rest were sent directly to the gas chambers. The camps functioned through a blend of mechanical efficiency and human cruelty. Prisoners were dehumanized, stripped of identity, and assigned numbers in place of names. Forced labor, starvation, disease, and execution were constant. Guards and administrators, many drawn from ordinary backgrounds, carried out orders with a mixture of obedience, fear, and ideological conviction. Bureaucracy sustained the process. Trains scheduled on time, records meticulously kept, supplies requisitioned, all contributing to a machinery of death that operated within the framework of a modern state. The Holocaust also depended on collaboration and complicity beyond Germany's borders. Local authorities, police forces, and civilians in occupied territories often assisted in identifying, rounding up, or deporting Jews. Some participated willingly, others acted out of fear or opportunism. At the same time, there were acts of courage, individuals and groups who hid or aided the persecuted, risking their own lives in defiance of terror. These stories of resistance and rescue, though rare, remind us of the persistence of moral choice, even in the face of overwhelming evil. As the war turned against Germany, evidence of the genocide became increasingly difficult to conceal. The SS attempted to destroy records, dismantle camps, and eliminate witnesses. Yet when Allied forces advanced in 1944 and 1945, they uncovered the full horror of what had been done. Liberation of camps like Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, and Auschwitz revealed emaciated survivors, mass graves, and warehouses filled with the possessions of the dead. The shock reverberated worldwide, forcing humanity to confront the magnitude of the crime. In the aftermath of the war, The Holocaust reshaped moral, legal, and historical understanding. The Nuremberg trials established the precedent that individuals could be held accountable for crimes against humanity. Survivors began to tell their stories, documenting experiences that challenged comprehension. Over time, historians, writers, and educators have worked to preserve memory, analyze causes, and ensure that such atrocities are neither forgotten nor repeated. What makes the Holocaust so chilling is not only its brutality, but its ordinariness. The way it was planned in offices, executed by bureaucrats, and supported by ordinary people who convinced themselves they were simply doing their jobs. It reveals the terrifying potential of ideology, fear, and obedience when combined with the machinery of a modern state. In essence, the Holocaust was the ultimate expression of Nazi ideology, a fusion of racial theory, authoritarian control, and the belief in the subjugation or elimination of those who did not fit into the regime's constructed vision of humanity. It stands as a permanent reminder of how prejudice, when institutionalized and weaponized, can destroy entire civilizations. Understanding this period is not merely about remembering the past, it is about recognizing the structures and attitudes that allowed it to happen. The Holocaust compels reflection on moral responsibility, human dignity, and the fragile boundaries between civilization and barbarism. Even as the world has moved forward, its lessons remain urgent because they reveal not just what was done, but what people are capable of when ideology overrides conscience. By 1944, the tide of war had decisively turned against Nazi Germany. The years of conquest, expansion, and domination had given way to retreat, destruction, and the steady collapse of the regime. The fall of Nazi Germany was not sudden. It unfolded through a series of devastating military defeats, internal disintegration, and the unraveling of a totalitarian state that had once seemed unshakable. On the Eastern Front, the turning point came with the Battle of Stalingrad in the winter of 1942-1943. The German Sixth Army, trapped and surrounded in the frozen ruins of the city, was forced to surrender after months of brutal fighting. The defeat shattered the myth of German invincibility and marked the beginning of a relentless Soviet advance westward. Each subsequent battle, Kursk, Smolensk, and the long struggle for the Baltic states, eroded Germany's strength and morale. The vastness of the Soviet Union, combined with its industrial capacity and manpower, overwhelmed the German war machine that had once swept through Europe with such confidence. In the West, the Allied invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, opened a second front. The D-Day landings brought thousands of American, British, and Canadian troops onto French soil, initiating a massive and coordinated push toward Germany. Despite fierce resistance, the German army was unable to contain the advance. Within weeks, Paris was liberated, and by the end of the year, Allied forces were approaching the borders of the Reich itself. The relentless bombing campaigns that targeted German cities, factories, and infrastructure further weakened the nation's ability to sustain the war effort. Inside Germany, the consequences of total war were devastating. Cities lay in ruins, food was scarce, and morale was collapsing. Propaganda still proclaimed imminent victory, but few believed it. The population endured air raids, rationing, and the dislocation of millions of refugees fleeing from the advancing Eastern Front. The once tightly controlled society began to fracture as the realities of defeat became undeniable. Within the regime, loyalty began to waver. In July 1944, a group of military officers and conservative politicians attempted to assassinate Hitler in what became known as the July 20th plot. The conspirators hoped to overthrow the Nazi leadership and negotiate peace with the Allies. The attempt failed, and the regime responded with brutal reprisals. Thousands were arrested, and many were executed. Yet the plot revealed deep cracks within the system, as even those who had once served it now recognized its inevitable downfall. As 1945 began, Germany faced invasion from both east and west. The Soviets closed in on Berlin, while the Western Allies crossed the Rhine. The once formidable Wehrmacht was reduced to fragmented units, undersupplied, and demoralized. Civilians bore the brunt of the devastation, as entire towns and cities were destroyed in the fighting. The propaganda machine continued to urge resistance to the last man, but the outcome was clear. In April 1945, Soviet forces reached Berlin. The final battle was fought street by street, building by building, in an atmosphere of chaos and desperation. Amid the ruins, the remnants of the Nazi leadership gathered in the Führer bunker, deep beneath the Chancellery. Hitler, refusing to flee or surrender, continued to issue orders disconnected from reality. On April 30th, 1945, as Soviet troops closed in, he took his own life, alongside his longtime companion, Eva Braun. Their deaths marked the symbolic end of the Third Reich. After Hitler's death, the remaining German forces surrendered in stages. On May 8, 1945, known as Victory in Europe Day, Germany formally capitulated. The war in Europe was over. What remained of the Nazi state dissolved almost immediately, leaving a nation shattered by defeat, haunted by guilt, and physically devastated. The once powerful regime, which had aspired to last 1,000 years, had collapsed after just 12. The aftermath was complex and profound. Germany was divided into 4 occupation zones, administered by the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. The Allied powers faced the immense task of rebuilding a nation while dismantling the political and ideological structures that had sustained Nazism. This process, known as denazification, sought to remove former Nazi officials from positions of authority, reform educational and cultural institutions, and confront the moral and legal implications of the regime's crimes. The Nuremberg trials, held between 1945 and 1946, became a defining moment in this process. Leading figures of the Nazi regime were prosecuted for crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The trials were unprecedented, an attempt to establish legal accountability for actions committed under the authority of a state. Testimonies, documents, and film evidence revealed the full extent of atrocities committed during the war, particularly the Holocaust. The verdicts set important precedents in international law, asserting that obedience to orders did not absolve individuals of moral or legal responsibility. Meanwhile, Germany faced a humanitarian crisis. Millions were displaced, infrastructure was destroyed, and resources were scarce. Cities such as Dresden, Hamburg, and Cologne were reduced to rubble. The population grappled with both physical survival and the moral reckoning of understanding what had been done in their name. In the immediate post-war years, the focus was on rebuilding, but beneath the surface lay unspoken grief, denial, and silence, a collective trauma that would take decades to fully confront. The division of Germany eventually solidified into two states: the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, aligned with the Western Allies, and the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, under Soviet influence. Each state approached the legacy of Nazism differently. In the West, efforts were made to integrate democracy, free speech, and accountability into the national identity. In the East, the communist regime framed anti-fascism as its founding ideology, emphasizing collective guilt and the rejection of capitalist systems seen as enabling fascism. Both societies struggled with memory, responsibility, and identity in their own ways. Across the world, the fall of Nazi Germany reshaped geopolitics. Europe entered a new era defined by the Cold War, as former allies became rivals. The United Nations was established with the goal of preventing future global conflict and promoting human rights. The experiences of the war and the revelations of the Holocaust influenced international law, ethics, and the understanding of human rights, creating a framework for global justice that continues to shape international relations today. Culturally and philosophically, the collapse of the Third Reich forced humanity to confront profound questions about morality, obedience, and the nature of evil. How could a society so advanced in science, art, and philosophy produce such destruction? How could ordinary individuals participate in or tolerate systematic cruelty? These questions have inspired decades of reflection, scholarship, and artistic expression as people around the world have sought to understand both the historical facts and their deeper meaning. The fall of Nazi Germany was not just the end of a war, it was the end of an illusion, the ideology that promised order, unity, and greatness had delivered only ruin. The cities lay in ashes, the population traumatized, and the moral foundation of a civilization deeply shaken. Yet from that devastation emerged a renewed commitment to the values of peace, democracy, and human dignity, a determination to ensure that the horrors of that era would never be repeated. And now, with a smile on your face, you will have a good understanding of Nazi Germany, its rise, its power, its fall, and the lessons it left behind. Close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let the echoes of history settle into quiet reflection. Good night, dear friend. See you next time.